Good morning, please take your seats. We will start. As you most likely saw, we have a very busy schedule, and I am trying to keep the schedule so you can go home at the time it indicates you can go home. If possible, we will finish earlier. I know that's highly appreciated, but for this, of course, we need to start as much as possible in time. So thank you. After the break, I would like to see you come a little bit closer, because the idea is really, you only have, well, we have 5 modules in this program. You only have 2 days on site to interact with the experts here present. Our first speaker is Professor Michel Goldman. It's an honor for me to say that I've been working with Michel for the past 11 years. 11 years ago, we set up this institute, and this was the result. Today, we start the 10th edition of this interdisciplinary program. Michel, thank you for being here again, and it's my pleasure.
Thank you so much, Hilde. I'm really very glad to meet you all, and I hope that you will enjoy this program and that you will appreciate all the talks that you will receive from really top experts across Europe. This program actually has been prepared by Hilde, and I will come back to that at the end of this very short introduction. And as an introduction, I would like to briefly tell you a bit more about myself and how I conceived this concept of this interdisciplinary and inter-university program 10 years ago, as you said. Actually, I started my career as a nephrologist and an immunologist taking care of patients. And I realized at the time that indeed all these patients were waiting for new therapies, new approaches to their disease. And I also realized that as academics, we cannot do it alone. We have to collaborate, especially at the time with the pharmaceutical industry. And after I create in Belgium a public-private partnership with GSK, dealing mainly with vaccine, I got the wonderful opportunity to build and lead the European Innovative Medicines Initiative, which is a very important partnership fully dedicated to health. And actually, the operations of this Innovative Medicine Initiative called IMI, and as I will explain, it became later IHI, Innovative Health Initiative. So we start the operation in 2009, and with a huge budget of 2 billion euros. And the idea was really to create new types of partnerships. And you will hear more, and you are really fortunate to hear more from the current executive director of the IHI, Niklas Blomberg, a little bit later this morning. Thank you again for being with us, Niklas. I know how busy you are. And what we did with this budget was to launch a number of public-private consortia with the aim to accelerate the development of innovative drugs for several disorders. And each consortium, each project involved multiple stakeholders, not only from universities and big pharmaceutical industries, but also from biotech companies, from regulatory agencies, and patient organizations. Now, this project delivered a number of new important tools, such as tools to screen for new drugs. And you will hear the different tools that were used, especially in the European Lead Factory. And you will have this afternoon Dimitrios Tsalis, who was responsible for this European Lead Factory. And obviously, with the explosion of artificial intelligence, this is certainly an area, drug screening of drug candidates, which will become even more active. Also, new tools were delivered to make clinical trials more efficient. As you know, unfortunately, many clinical trials to develop new drugs actually fail, and this is because their design is very often not adequate. Recruitment of patients very often doesn't go the way it should. And again, the Innovative Medicines Initiative tried to improve the way clinical trials are conducted. Also, you have to look at the efficacy and the safety of new medicines, and for this you need so-called biomarkers. And actually, IMI was also very active in developing new biomarkers. Also, and I could, tell you more about this number of projects, but importantly, there was several projects very important for the fight against infectious diseases. As you know, unfortunately nowadays, many bacteria have become resistant to available antibiotics. And this problem of antimicrobial resistance is really a huge problem, which was really seriously addressed by IMI. And there are several aspects, new drugs, but also new ways to incentivize industry to develop these new drugs. Also, this public-private partnership was very important in developing a new vaccine against the Ebola virus. And finally, during the COVID-19 pandemics, actually the largest European network to fight the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which caused COVID-19, was developed under this initiative. So I will not be longer, but in short, what was created was a new European ecosystem dedicated to solving major health issues. Now, let me briefly summarize what I personally learned during my mandate at IMI. First lesson, we need to mobilize scientists from different disciplines to move medical research and innovation in health forward. Let's take the COVID-19 as an example. Obviously, to develop the new vaccines against COVID-19, you need virologists. The virologists were able to identify the genome of the virus, which was a critical element to develop these mRNA and adenoviral vector vaccine. But you also need immunologists to look at the immune response that the vaccine is elicited to be sure that this is indeed the right response which is needed. You also need physicists who create and imagine these lipid nanoparticles, which are so important to deliver the mRNA in the body. You need also bioinformatics specialists and public health experts, and all these people have to work together. And clearly, you need more than those scientific disciplines that have, in a way, to converge to reach this common objective, in this case, to create a new vaccine. But more than that, in addition to, the usual scientists, we need people involved in regulation, people who understood that it was necessary to introduce those vaccines as rapidly as possible without, taking any risk related to safety. We need lawyers who had to deal with the intellectual property issues related to the development of the vaccines, and most importantly, patients and citizens, I'm thinking about, the citizens who accepted to be volunteers to test the new vaccines without knowing whether they will be efficacious and whether they will or not have some unwanted effects. Second lesson, collaboration between academia and industry allows to combine the strengths of the academic labs, strengths in terms of creativity, in terms of imagination, which led to key discoveries, but also the strengths of industry, where you will find the very important management and organization skills. And I realized that there was a clear need to build trust between universities and industry, and this is certainly one of the important aspects of these partnerships. And again, I would like to insist on the fact that in terms of industry, it's not only the big pharma, but also biotechs and companies involved in medical technologies. I insist on this because some of you might, one day or another, work for one of those companies. Third lesson, which is actually the lesson that led to the organization of this course. People like yourself, students, are not prepared to engage in public-private, or at least not well prepared to engage in public-private endeavors. In universities, and you know this very well again, teaching and research are often organized in silos, so that the convergence of discipline, which is so badly needed, is actually hampered instead of being promoted. This is really the reason why, when I finished my mandate at the Innovative Medicines Initiative and went back to the university, in this university, I decided to create this course to bring together students from different universities, but also from different faculties and disciplines, to educate them, to educate you about basic concepts underlying innovation in life science, and to learn working together as a common objective. And obviously, not all of you will be engaged in health in your future career, but at least some of you who currently do not know where they will work, but there is a good chance that many of you will be indeed involved in a way or another in health. And with this course, I hope that indeed you will be better prepared with the basic notions that you will acquire during this course. And to reach these objectives, to provide you with the basic concepts of health, we decide to invite experts of all over Europe to share their expertise and also their personal experience. Not only you will hear their thoughts, but also you will be invited to work together, to learn to work together, even if you are not in life science, you will collaborate with people involved in life science, even if you are in economics or in law or in public health. And you will learn indeed to work together to move innovation forward. Now, with the explosion of artificial intelligence, as I told you, we have new wonderful opportunity to make the convergence of disciplines much more efficient. So I am really convinced, and I hope that you will be yourself at the end of this course, that this program is indeed needed today more than ever. Now, it's not a time for Hilde Stevens to tell you more about this wonderful program that you put together. Hilde is professor both at the Faculty of Medicine and the Solvay Brussels School of Economics and Management. So again, it shows the interdisciplinary vision. And she's conducted research projects on several aspects of health innovation. She did her PhD in pharmaceutical science at KU Leuven, and her thesis was actually about the IMI, about the Innovative Medicines Initiative, so that you understand that she was really the ideal person to really set up this program and become finally the director of this course. Hilde, thank you so much for your commitment, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you. So it's a wonderful, thank you, Michelle, for this wonderful introduction into how I3H was set up and how actually we perceived what this course could mean for you. And I will try to further convince you. You are 120 students registered. You're not all here today, I see. Coming from 10 universities in Europe, in Belgium, but some come from universities outside Belgium. And you come from different faculties. And I hope you are master's students, PhD students, postdocs, and we even have some professionals. And I really hope to convince you that you are needed to tackle the next or some of the global health challenges we face and how we can accelerate affordable innovation through interdisciplinary collaboration. Because none of us, as Michelle rightfully told us, none of us will be able to solve global health challenges alone. Can you mention some of the global health challenges that you know today we face? And this course is really interactive. The idea that you are on site is that you collaborate with the experts present. Please raise your hands and mention one or two global health challenges. Antibiotic resistance. Voilà. AMR indeed is a very, very persistent threat and it grows, and we will have to tackle this. Another challenge that we face with respect to health innovation? Yes. Access, indeed, access. It's not enough to bring an invention, to have an invention in the lab. Access to affordable healthcare is super important because without adoption by the patients, we don't speak about innovation. So you're a diverse audience here, and actually this diversity actually mirrors healthcare itself. It's not about medicine. It's economics, engineering, data science, social sciences, policy, ethics, and design operating all at once. And the core message of this presentation, as well as the core message of this whole course, is really simple. Many of the biggest healthcare challenges today are not due to the lack of scientific ideas, but due to a lack of interdisciplinary collaboration that accelerates affordable innovation. We saw, and actually COVID was a perfect example of how we can, or such threats can disrupt health system, both to the advantage of the system, but also to the disadvantage. And I think through COVID, we saw widening global health disparities. Definitely. We also saw that there is a shortage, a burning shortage of healthcare workers, and they increasingly face burnout. We have an aging population. The care for patients becomes increasingly complex because we live much longer, with much more comorbidities. We have a worsening mental health, I think you are quite aware, with long waiting lists for definitely also young people, but all patients. And then, obviously, I don't have to tell you that there is a rising inflation. We face increasing geopolitical issues. We have tariffs, which is a serious threat to the the European competitiveness. We have climate change, which really weighs on health outcomes, energy crisis. Then we saw through COVID that there is a huge opportunity and challenges for alternative care models. Telemedicine, there are huge opportunities, and still not all is valued and implemented yet. All the opportunities we face, there's a huge increase in digital innovation, AI, and connectivity, wearables, different apps, and obviously scientific advancement. I don't have to elaborate on that. And then, as I already said, there's an increasing healthcare spending. And this week, it was mentioned, and this is in Dutch, but it's everywhere actually in Europe the same. We increasingly spend, or our expenditures increase. 5.6 billion euros are spent to healthcare, and it keeps on increasing. So we face challenges because our healthcare budget is under stress. We need new ways to tackle these expenditures. And one thing that's, there are different initiatives, and actually at 3H we are with the group working on some propositions to tackle Europe's competitive position, increase our competitive position, tackle drugs shortages, but also definitely how we can tackle defragmentation in Europe. We are 27 member states, all trying to negotiate prices with industry to have, or to make sure that patients nationally get as fast as possible access to innovative health therapies. We should combine our forces. And this is joint procurement, equity-based tiered pricing. All these incentives and economic aspects will be elaborated throughout this course. And healthcare is often framed as something that concerns hospitals and doctors, but in reality, healthcare shapes really almost every major societal system. It affects health outcomes, obviously, but also economic stability, because healthy populations are productive populations. It affects social equity, because access to care is one of the strongest predictors of life expectancy. It affects technology adoption, because healthcare is one of the most regulated and complex systems for innovation. And it even affects sustainability, as healthcare systems are major consumers of energy and materials. So regardless of whether you work in science, engineering, economics, or policy, you are already part of this healthcare system. The question is whether you engage with it intentionally or not. Globally, healthcare systems are under enormous pressure, and we see this with this aging population in most high-income countries, and at the same time, as I told you, a rapid rise of chronic diseases worldwide. The workers are in shortage everywhere. Costs continue to rise faster than GDP. Global supply chains, whether for drugs, diagnostics, or equipment, have proven fragile. The key point here is that most healthcare systems were designed decades ago for a different reality. They were optimized for acute care and not for long-term, complex, and global challenges. What we are seeing now is systems being pushed beyond their original design assumption. And one of the biggest paradoxes in modern healthcare is this. We live in a time of extraordinary medical innovation, yet access, as we heard, access to that innovation is deeply, deeply unequal. Breakthrough exists, the science works, but access depends on where you live, how much you earn, and how your healthcare system is organized. And this tells us something very important. Inequality in healthcare is not primarily a scientific problem. It's a systems problem. It's about design choices, incentives, infrastructure, and governance. So access and affordability sit at the center of many global healthcare challenges. Innovation is expensive. Research and development costs are high, manufacturing can be complex, IP, intellectual property structures shape who can produce what, and reimbursement system, they determine whether innovations are actually used. Too often, affordability is threatened as a downstream issue, something to worry about after when innovation already exists. But by that point, many key decisions have already been locked in. Affordability is not something you add later on. It's something you design from the beginning. And COVID-19 vaccines are a powerful example, as Michelle also alluded to, both to show successes and failure of the system. From a scientific perspective, vaccine development was astonishingly fast. Collaboration between academia, industry, and regulators enabled vaccines to be developed in less than a year. But from a global systems perspective, the outcome was actually very uneven. Many countries in the global south face delayed access due to limited manufacturing capacity, cold chain requirements, supply bottlenecks, and intellectual property constraints. And the key lesson here is that scientific speed across, it does not automatically translate to global impacts. Biology was not the main bottleneck here. It was manufacturing, economics, and governance issues. And if we zoom out, vaccine success actually depends on far more than biology. Life sciences, sure, it enables discovery. Engineering enables large-scale manufacturing and logistics. Economics shape the pricing and reimbursement, and the procurement, of course. Law and policy, they determine regulation and intellectual property. Global health expertise is essential for the distribution and the trust, as are social sciences, because anti-vaxxers and vaccine hesitancy are also a major and growing health challenge. And diagnostics are one of the most underappreciated parts of healthcare innovation. Early diagnosis can save life or reduce long-term costs. Yet diagnostics are often underfunded, undervalued, and poorly integrated into healthcare systems. Many systems still reward treatment much more than prevention. This creates the paradox that diagnostics are relatively inexpensive compared to therapeutics, to treatment, and still they remain inaccessible in many settings. And we see here the example of the mini-lab. You will hear about this in the final module on the Sustainable Development Goals and how to reach universal health coverage. And on the other hand, you see footprint or the prenatal screening, which really, the sooner you diagnose patients, the sooner you can help them, and the more you can stop disease progression. So effective diagnostics, they really sit at the intersection of multiple disciplines. Engineers, they design robust, low-cost tools. Clinicians ensure that there's clinical relevance. Economists help create sustainable pricing models. Social scientists really can address trust and adoption issues. And system designers then integrate diagnostics into workflows. And if any of these perspectives is missing, then diagnostics will fail to deliver their impact, and to reach their full impact. And digital health and AI are often presented as solutions to almost every healthcare problem. With apps, algorithms, wearables, platforms, they are everywhere. Yet the real world impact remains limited. Many tools never move beyond pilots. Others add complexity rather than reducing it. The core issue is that many digital solutions are built around technological possibilities rather than real clinical and organizational needs. And in many European public healthcare systems, AI tools for radiology and imaging shows great technical promise. They can improve efficiency and support clinicians into diagnosing patients and deciding on their therapy trajectory. But adoption has been slow. And why? Actually, because there's a real mismatch in the workflow, the regulatory uncertainty, the unclear reimbursement pathways. Public healthcare systems, they demand integration, safety, and accountability, not just novelty. This example highlights the need for early collaboration between engineers, clinicians, politicians, policymakers in general, and economists. And when we look across the examples from COVID or this one, a pattern emerges. Technologies fail not because they don't work, but because they are not designed for real systems. They lack clinician co-design, economic incentives, interoperability, or early ethical consideration. And innovation is really not the same as deployment. Impact happens only when technologies fit into complex realities. And healthcare is actually a classic example of a complex, highly regulated, one of the most regulated sectors. But an adaptive system. It involves many stakeholders, feedback loops, cultural norms, political constraints, and non-linear outcomes. Small changes can have long-term and very large effects, and well-intended interventions can fail unexpectedly. And this complexity means that linear, single-discipline solutions rarely scale. It's really about exploring why technologies fail in real systems and how we can optimize through co-design. And this is really what we here at I3H and with this course aim to help you further develop this idea of co-creation. Interdisciplinary collaboration does not mean working in parallel silos. It means shared problem framing, integrated methods, joint ownership of outcomes. The key shift is from optimizing individual contributions to optimizing system performance. And that requires humility, communication, good communication, and trust across disciplines. So no matter what your background is, your ability to collaborate across disciplines will shape your impact in healthcare. Learn to speak other disciplines' language. Ask system-level questions. Seek collaboratively and collaborators very early on in your ideas. And always ask yourself who is missing at the table. Shared problem framing here really means aligning on the core challenges before developing independent solutions. Some of you will choose to think about a case study for the certificate track and all the practicalities I will explain this evening, just before you leave. Think about what I say now. Think about shared problem framing. Think about integrated methods. Combine disciplinary approaches into a unified development strategy. Think about joint ownership, collective responsibility for the success or failure of system outcome. And then the system performance focus on the whole rather than the individual technical contributions. And most innovation fails actually not at the ID stage, but really at the handoffs between discovery and development, between development and validation, or scaling and adoption. Each handoff often crosses disciplinary boundaries, and if those boundaries are not actively managed, promising innovations might stall or fail. And affordability should be treated as core design constraint, not a secondary concern. We were part with I3H of a huge European consortium where we looked at the effect of different incentives on innovation. And there, our key message, we collaborated with Imperial College, top economists. Our message was really includes this whole affordability and early access as soon as possible because it really affects the outcomes of patients. So it's really a core design concept, not something that comes at the end of innovation. And that means considering costs, scalability, and context from day one. Affordable access to healthcare is intentional. It doesn't happen by accident. Healthcare challenges are global, complex, and very, very urgent. And no single discipline can solve them alone. Interdisciplinary collaboration is not nice to have. It's the fastest way to affordable, equitable, and sustainable healthcare impact. I hope I managed to convey you that why you are here, whether or not you have a biomedical or a medical background, is super important. Indeed, as Michelle rightfully said, not all of you will become the next generation of healthcare professionals, but I'm sure that you will learn from it and look whatever you do in your future through your challenges, from another perspective, from a systems design perspective. We have today top experts with you, and you will see throughout the course we have experts coming from industry, patient organizations, universities, non-profit organizations, regulatory authorities. And as Michelle already introduced, we have today the director of IHI, which is Europe's, and I think the world's, largest public-private partnership in life sciences. I myself was already convinced of IMI back in 2010 when I started my PhD. I hope that Nicholas is able to convince you why this is highly needed to put industry, medtech, whatever, medtech, biotech, pharmaceutical companies together with researchers in non-profit institutions, regulatory authorities, and in the center of all those stakeholders, the patients. Okay? Because without the patients, there's no innovation. Thank you. We can.
Thank you very much, Hilda. So the first disclaimer, so I'm Niklas Blomberg, I'm leading the Innovative Health Initiative. We are the successor of the wonderful initiative Michelle set up now over 15 years ago. And I think I will bring some of the examples you mentioned on AMR and Ebola as discussion points here.
Do you want a pointer? Just
no, it'll be fine. Just Hilda said, don't let language be a barrier. My French is completely absent and my Dutch is even worse, but I could do German and Swedish if you but I think collectively I'm sure we will manage. And so and maybe this is the first lesson in collaboration, which is the topic of the lecture, is that don't let language barriers or cultural barriers stand in between. It's curiosity and an assumption of good intent goes a very, very long way. And all those barriers we usually overcome. I think that's one of the pleasures for me working in this space, is the international, multicultural, and both the challenges and the benefits. Like Hilda said, it'd be wonderful if this is interactive. I know it's the first day of a new course and it's intimidating and it's difficult, but
if we can try to have this a bit interactive, I think it would be a lot more fun for everyone. So don't be shy, raise your hand and we'll try to take some questions. There are lots of slides. I don't need to go through all of them. If we sort of go off on a tangent of something interesting, I think that's one of the benefits of having a group together in the lecture theatre. If you just want to quantify, you can do it on YouTube. So with that, so what I really want to talk about is collaboration and with some examples. And I think I'll start with what Hilde said. This is a complex space, and we need to work with people with very many different backgrounds. And I think it's important to approach that collaboration with curiosity and a willingness to learn, because one of the things that training does, it gives you a certain perspective of the world. And so once you start to break down these disciplinary silos and work together, you will have to work with people who have a very different view of the world and a different set of fundamental assumptions. And that, if you approach that with curiosity, it can be very, very enriching. If you approach it with a bit of arrogance, it's very, very difficult. And so I think that's one of the key messages. And I think you will do lots of group work, and so enjoy that. Michel, no, this doesn't work. That's fine. I'll do this. Don't worry, Nora. Michel talked about why was IMI set up, and I think fundamentally there was a realization. I mean, you were part of it, and I was still just out of graduate school at that time. That a lot of problems are too big certainly for individuals, certainly for a university group, but actually often also for a single company to take on by themselves. And so what we are trying to do as a European public partnership is really try to foster those large collaborations. And I don't want to leave with the impression that that's the only way of collaborating. There are many good things that can happen on a small local level, but I think some of the approaches is simply about scale. I am not going to talk a huge amount about IHI. I don't think that's the purpose of the lecture, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of flavor. So we are what we call a cross-sector public-private partnership for the whole of Europe. And cross-sector means that we work in pharmaceuticals, but we also work in medical technologies. And so it's both those industry sectors. And of course, we also work with the public and many of the civil society stakeholders, and I come back to that. And so what we do, and so this hasn't changed since IMI was set up back in 2010. What we really are about is creating, we call them bold collaborations, but excellent research programs that are bigger and more complex than individual organizations could take on by themselves. And so it really is about excellent research and bringing together the skills and the capabilities and the experts from industry, from academia, from patient organizations, from public organizations. And we do this to transform health. We say the entire spectrum of care. It can be, as Michel said, early biomarkers, trying to understand the disease and then develop a way to find a marker for how you treat that disease. But we also work all the way through healthcare system up to manufacturing. And so we have projects on innovative manufacturing of medicine and healthcare products. One example, which is actually our biggest project right now, is these forever chemicals, the PFAS. I'm sure you have read about them. So PFAS is everywhere in the healthcare. Every single injection needle in a hospital is covered in a PFAS-containing compound. This is why injections are not painful anymore. In the 50s, kids didn't like to have vaccines because it was painful. Still have a lot of friction. These days, the needles are covered. This is why we don't feel anything. A diabetic is taking samples every day. They don't feel anything. It's because we have covered the needles. How do we replace that? If you go to a heart valve, so heart replacement valve, 40% of a heart replacement valve is components that contain PFAS. So if we take it away, we can stop doing heart surgery. And so for healthcare, this is a huge problem. And so this is one example in the very end of the value chain. How do we tackle that as a European healthcare system? Because we just can't stop. because then we could stop heart operations tomorrow. And so that's the kind of, when we talk about transforming the whole health and care, those are the type of problems that we like to take on. Now, coming back to innovations, I couldn't resist. You do, when you give a lecture, you do what everyone else used to do. Now they go to AI, but I actually looked at Wikipedia. No, but so what is innovation? And this is actually one, I had a really good manager when I worked for AstraZeneca, who always said, never forget that innovation is one light bulb and 4 chevrons. So the ideas are the easy bit, but then you have to develop the ideas into something that actually works. And the innovation is not the idea bit. The innovation is that chevron bit. When you take the idea through a lot of stages to make sure that it is something at the end that creates value. And of course, Schumpeter was an industrial economist. What we really are looking for is a meaningful benefit on health and care. And so having an idea is one thing, but actually taking that idea through an innovation journey to have a meaningful benefit on health and care is something completely different. And I think that's what this whole course is about, is that journey from great ideas to meaningful benefit. Both Michelle and Hilde talked about why it's so important to have patience. And I often show this picture. This, for me, is one of the best illustrations I've seen. And we will share the slides afterwards. So I see people taking photos. That's obviously fine. But if you want, there will be slides handouts later. But so, why do you want patients? Why do you want participatory research? Why do you want the experience of the people who are living with the disease? This for me is a really good example. It's one of our projects called Radar AD. But the idea was to look at smart homes, to see if you can use smart homes and devices to detect and diagnose early onset dementia. So if you can find indicators and come in and start to treat dementia earlier. And so if you think about it, it's a really interesting piece of research, right? Can you use a smart home to detect dementia? You just say it, and then you start to think about it. So I think it's actually hard to come up with a piece of research which is more challenging from a privacy and ethical perspective. I mean, you have to think about it. You have measurement devices in people's home. They come up in the middle of the night to take a glass of water. They come in pajamas to get a cup of tea in the morning. You do all sorts of things in your kitchen that you may not want to share with a lot of other people. And so how do you go about doing a research project like this? Well, the answer was actually to work very, very closely with Alzheimer Europe, which is a patient organization. And it's not only about having an advisory board at the end of a project that say a few things. It really is about bringing the people living with disease. And of course, in case of dementia, it's not only the patients, but also their families and the carers, to think about how could you actually design this research project? What are the things that you can measure? How will you handle that data? How will you analyze that data? How will you formulate the conclusions of that data in a way that is respectful and acceptable by the patient community? So it's that whole sort of innovation cycle needs input from the lived experience of disease. But once you do that, you can actually do these quite unique pieces of research. And so I think that's one of the messages I really like to leave with you, is that if you think about participatory research, it doesn't only allow you to do research differently, but it can actually allow you to do different research, to do projects that otherwise wouldn't be possible. And so I think that is a very important perspective. And I think Maria later today will talk a lot more about the patient journey and the participatory research. But I think try to keep that it's not only about doing research differently. It can actually be about doing different research, doing things that otherwise wouldn't be possible, come up with insights that you would never have without that participation. So we talked, so I can, sorry, I give, if there are questions, then just raise your hand and feel free to reflect, not only have a question, but to reflect. So we talked a bit, there is no timer here. Hilde, you will help me.
Yes, you have time. I finished early.
I left my phone in the pocket. So, we talked about the health innovation journey. So the chevrons, I see the cartoons are coming up here. But so if we sort of make a simple health innovation journey, we talked about translational research, the sort of early stages, whether it's pharmaceutical, whether it's diagnostics, whether it's a new insight to a disease, whether it's a new treatment way, whether it's a medical device. But you have some research innovation. You will have to take that through some sort of clinical trial, some regulatory piece. We are working with humans. Things need to be safe and they need to be efficacious. And there needs to be a rigorous way of assessing that safety and efficacy. And that's true for medical devices. It's true for pharmaceutical products, medicines. It's of course true for diagnostics as well. You need to be convinced that they are safely administered, but also give a right response. Once you have that, you need to think about how does that sit in the healthcare system. So is the healthcare system actually ready? And I think Hilde talked about this. Is the healthcare system ready to take on this innovation? There is a set of new Alzheimer treatments coming out. I think they are a really interesting example here. So some of these new Alzheimer medicines, it's the first medicines that seem to be slowing down cognitive decline. So they seem to be effective if you give them early enough in Alzheimer. However, for some patients, they also give a very dangerous condition of brain swelling. So when you administer these medicines, you need to monitor patients with advanced imaging technology so that you can detect if there is a side effect of brain swelling, because then, of course, you have to stop. Now, that means it's not only a medicine that you can hand out to individuals and move on. You need to think about how do you administer this in the context of the whole healthcare system. Do you actually have the capacity to do imaging on these patients? Do you have access to the equipment? Can you only give this in big cities? How do you do in the rural areas? Will these patients have to come into Brussels from the remote parts of Belgium to be monitored? Belgium is a small country. I'm from Sweden. If you have 10 hours drive to the hospital, it's not very realistic to come in for this imaging once a week. And so the health system part of the health innovation is really quite important. And now I'll give a few examples of that. And then, of course, Hilde talked about economies, but the outcomes and value. I mean, is it actually worth in Europe? We have solidaric healthcare systems. So we pay collectively for everyone's healthcare. So that means money you put on one treatment is money that you don't have to put on another treatment. Because no matter how big the budget, it will never be infinite. And so you will always have to make a choice of how you put the money inside the healthcare system. How do you actually determine that value? That's a really, and there's a lot of innovation happening in Europe right now. There is a joint health technology assessment, the value assessment. How will the sort of business and payment models for the future look like? I was really excited to hear about the work you had done with Imperial. I'd love to learn more about that. And then of course, manufacturing. You have to make the products at some point. And the manufacturing practices of yesterday are not going to be acceptable today or tomorrow. We need to find ways of manufacturing without destroying the nature in Europe and the rest of the world. And of course, we need to make sure that we are competitive. because there is a global market. So how do we ensure that there is a manufacturing base in Europe? That's a lot of innovation. And how I talked about PFAS. How do we deal with these large sort of greening challenges of the healthcare? Think about all the blister packs. How many medicine blister packs are we consuming on a daily basis? They are very hard. It's metal, aluminium, and plastic. It's very hard to recycle that sort of mixture. And yet, how do you store medicines in a way so they don't degrade? It's a really interesting question. Actually, innovation in packaging is really important. When I worked in AstraZeneca, that was one of the things that was not outsourced. Having good packaging was seen as a competitive advantage, and you didn't want to give that to China. So it was kept in-house. Whereas manufacturing of the actual drug, you happily did in China because it wasn't a competitive advantage in the same way. So it's important. There are innovation opportunities across the whole of the value chain. And again, no discipline is superior. We all need all the disciplines from engineering to social sciences. So I hope I've convinced you that this is a space where it's not only necessary, but also fun to collaborate. And so if we look at, so this is a snapshot of our grants. So we, as Michelle said, what we do is we fund these collaborative projects. And so this is a quick snapshot of who has been involved in our grants to date. And so, of course, there's a lot of large companies, a lot of industry. Half the program is funded by industry, so that goes without saying. A lot of universities and academic organizations. Well, we are a research program. If you want leading research, you will have to bring in the leading universities of Europe and the leading academics. A lot of SMEs, small innovative companies, all the way from sort of 2-3 people startups to sort of mid-size innovation organizations. But I think the interesting part is also we see a lot of an increasing participation of healthcare organizations. So not only physicians, research doctors who are coming in with their university T-shirt on, but actually the healthcare system, the hospital is coming in and looking at how they can evolve and develop the care systems. And many hospitals now start to have, and I think is really interesting, they have these innovation clinics. So they are looking at how can they deliver the care of tomorrow. I recently visited or had a discussion with Denmark, the largest hospital in Copenhagen. They have put themselves a target to move 80% of the treatments they do today in the hospital into the patient's home in 2035, 10 years from now. So in 10 years, they want to move from 20% of the treatment given outside the hospital to 80% of the treatment given in people's homes. And so that's a huge change. It's a huge opportunity for innovation. And it will change the way we are interacting with healthcare all the way through, because the other thing that happens then is that the patients don't come to the specialist clinics very often. So how will you recruit patients to your clinical trials? It's a good question. That's another opportunity for innovation. And so all of these changes are opportunities for interesting research and innovation projects. So simply, we have patients, civil society organizations, they are really important for us, and we are actively looking to ensure what we call a deep and meaningful engagement of patients in our projects. So public authorities, regulators. So it's not only, they are not only the sort of the guardrails of the system, but of course we do a lot of innovation work with them, because the key question for regulators like the European Medicines Agency or the national agencies is of course, what science do they need to engage in and do today so that they understand how to regulate the products of tomorrow? And so we work very closely with EMA on their regulatory science roadmap. And it's essentially that question: what science do they need to do today so they are ready to assess the products tomorrow? And so that's another opportunity for innovation. And then we have many other types. We even actually have logistics companies in our projects. If we look at remote sampling, can you do clinical trials with sampling in people's home? That's really interesting. But to do that, you need the courier companies. So we have some of these big courier companies in some of our projects. Can you ship samples in a quick and a safe and effective way from people's home into a assessment on a European scale? That's another interesting question. That will also require a little bit of thinking and innovation. Very different from molecular biology, but there is scope for innovation. So and I think this is an IHI project, but I think what does any of these good projects look like? Well, of course, they start with addressing unmet public health needs. There needs to be some unmet public health needs underpinning the research question. We are, of course, mandated and looking to strengthen the whole ecosystem in Europe. But otherwise, we are looking for cross-sector partnerships between public and private entities. We call them pre-competitive. I think what that means is that we want to have projects where more than one company can engage because it's addressing something systemic. We don't fund product development in a single company. Other funders do that. Venture capitalists do that. We don't do that. We are looking for that sort of systemic change, the opportunity where 5, 6 pharma companies can come together because it's interesting enough for many of the actors. And of course, that often leads us to be big and ambitious. And I think that's been a hallmark all the way from the start, is that this is a little view on our pipeline or projects, sort of mapped over this space. You will see that it's I cut and pasted the logos more or less alphabetically, with a few exceptions. And so there is a preponderance of A and B in the acronyms. But as you see, when we say that we address the entire spectrum of care, this is what we mean. We address the entire spectrum of care, and there is opportunities for innovation and collaboration all the way through this space. So 2 examples. So I'll start with, Michelle mentioned this, the Ebola program. So this came out, I think, right at the end of your tenure at IMI. And so maybe you should tell the story and not me, Michelle. But of course, there was a large outbreak in Africa of Ebola, and Europe needed to create a fast response. And so the European Commission and the drug industry and IMI was really the instrument to make this happen. And I think that's because the partnership was trusted by all the actors and also agile enough to be able to set up a program quickly in response. And so there was essentially a programmatic approach looking at that whole innovation chain to say, what can we do to make sure that we get a vaccine out in Africa to the sites of Ebola? And it was launched in 2014. And the first calls were opened a couple of months later in 2015. And so this is how it looked at the end. And so I mean, the credit go to Michelle and the group who started it. But it's really, as you see, it really is that comprehensive view of the whole innovation journey. You're not going to solve this with a single project. You have to look at what is the development of the vaccine, and you see there is a whole series of projects that look at the Ebola vaccine. But it's not enough to actually develop the vaccine. You also have to manufacture it at scale. And so there was a project on manufacturing. There was a project on deployment. So how do you actually get this out into the clinics in Africa? Because you can only do the clinical trials where people have the disease. And so that means that you have to do the clinical trials in Africa where people are affected by the hemorrhagic fevers. And then, of course, you need to have a complement with diagnostics. As Hilde said, diagnostics is a really challenging field. And point of care diagnostics for many of the neglected or tropical diseases is a huge challenge. And so that's an area, it's difficult to fund, it's difficult to reimburse, but it's also quite difficult to develop. And so that's a big innovation area. Look at organizations like CEPI, the Coalition for Pandemic Preparedness. Point of care diagnostics is one of the things they are really very interested in taking forward, because you need to have rapid, reliable point of care diagnostics. We have all lived through that, through the COVID crisis. I mean, you couldn't go out unless you had swiped or taken one of these COVID tests. And so that's how a program looked like. And you see the budget is significant, but it's not enough to think in one of the silos. You really have to go through the whole innovation cycle. Michel, do you want to add something here?
No, that's fine.
I mean, you have the insights of having actually done this. But I have to say, and I mean, I started far after it, I think this is really one of the big successes of European research programs. If you look at it, in the end, there was a Ebola vaccine manufactured by J&J, but 200,000 people were vaccinated in the Rwanda outbreak in 2019. And I think it's fair to say that quelled the outbreak. And so if you compare with the 2016 Congo outbreak, in Rwanda, there was you did not have the epidemic scale and the casualties. The outbreak was really sort of quelled. I think the other thing that happened, it showed that you could deploy these vaccines at scale. And so now there are actually several Ebola vaccines on the market, which is a good thing because there are many strains and they seem to be effective in different combinations with different strains. But you see, it's the diagnostics were really key to detect the virus rapidly and early, and so to be able to control the outbreak, because it's not only the vaccination, it's also the public health side of containment. And then, of course, you need to couple this with research actions. We've had projects, had people on the field in Africa trying to inform and combat misinformation and vaccine hesitancy. And of course, Ebola is challenging because it also cuts across a lot of the cultural norms. So there are things like burying practices that needs to be changed, because suddenly the family can't bury their deceased loved ones in this way they have always done. And so that's huge challenging, very, very difficult. And so it's not only about technology. It is, as Hilde said, it is also about the social context of that technology to be able to make a difference. I'm not going to dwell on the vaccine, but there has been over the years quite a large vaccine portfolio, sort of addressing both many different vaccines and many of the constraints in the vaccine development chain. For Ebola, we have a number of projects on AMR. We have right now the two largest tuberculosis projects in the world are funded funded under IMI. We are still shepherding them. If all goes well, there will hopefully be some phase 2 readouts during next year. And it looks like there might be solutions for drug-resistant tuberculosis emerging. And so the compounds that might be ready to go into phase 3. And so these partnerships can really make a difference. And I think that's one of the other message I want to leave you with. So with that, I'll stop with some marketing, I guess, but talking about what can be achieved. So what I also wanted to talk a little bit about is really, so how do you build then these partnerships? So what are the things that you need to put in place for this to happen at scale? And so on a big scale, but I think it's the same thing that applies to a small piece of school group work. You have to sort of start small and scale it up, but the fundamentals are still the same. And I wrote a little commentary together with Carmen Hurtado, who leads the European part of a diabetes foundation called Breakthrough T1D. We have done a lot of work, and I think it started already in IMI with Breakthrough T1D to look at type 1 diabetes over the years. And so we wanted to just distill a few thoughts about what actually makes these partnerships work and what makes partnerships between industry, philanthropic organization, and then large European funders like IHI work, because it's not easy. They are very different organizations. We have the complexity and the bureaucracy that follows with handling European money at scale, because you want to make sure that they are not being used in a fraudulent way, embezzled or put into a bridge to nowhere. So it's quite a lot of control functions for the European when you spend public money. Of course, industry likes to move quick, and philanthropic organizations, they have a big responsibility to their donors. These are families that have invested in them to make a difference in that disease. And so how do you actually get that collaboration working? And so we came up with three sort of fundamentals to make this partnership work. And so we distilled them in the sort of right topic, right capabilities, and the right implementation. The right implementation is a lot about trust. And so I'd like to just go through them in order, and if you have thoughts or comments or reflections, I mean, just raise your hand here. So I'll start with right topic. Now, I mean, this sounds like motherhood and apple pie. I mean, it sounds absolutely obvious, right? Of course, it needs to be the right topic. The problem is that the right topic is just as hard as it sounds obvious. So what is the sweet spot for collaboration? Because if you don't pick the right topic, there will be discomfort. The jacket doesn't really fit. The shoes are a little bit too small. Something isn't quite right. And so it sounds absolutely obvious. It needs to be the right topic. And it's really quite hard. This is the hardest bit, is to get the question right. What is the question where it's worth for everyone to engage? And so just to elaborate on a little bit, because what we're really trying to do is align both investments, money, and priorities from organizations that have very different ways of spending money and possibly very different strategic priorities. And so when you start to break it down, it's not only about the interesting research topic, it really is about making sure that you align priorities in a way that people are prepared to put the money into these projects. And so you want to mobilize investment from industry, philanthropic and public funders, but you also want to mobilize the skills and the innovation capabilities, say, of the private sector. I'll come back to that. And you can do this if the opportunity of the collaboration is greater than the cost for all the partners, because all the partners have an opportunity cost. And I think that is true at scale, but it's also true when you are putting together three people together to write an essay, because you can always go and do something else than to work in this little group. And so how do you find a topic or a problem where the opportunity of a solution fits the strategic agenda of all the contributing partners? That is often hard. This is why topic definition takes months, lots of discussion, because one always have to think about what is the opportunity cost for the others. How do we build something which is win-win-win? Because you can't play win-lose. If you play win-lose, people will go away. I don't want to, I mean, I win, you lose. Well, then you would leave. And so you always have to find that win-win. And so that's why the right topic is really quite hard. And so I'll work with sort of a case study here on type 1 diabetes. So the work we've done with Inodia. So what is in it here for the different partners? And so we'll take this through the story. But what is in it? So why would IMI engage? Well, obviously, because this is an important unmet public health need. Type 1 diabetes is actually increasing in children in Europe, but it's also an area where Europe is actually leading. And so Europe can get a competitive edge. So if we are looking to put European taxpayers' money into research projects, there is opportunity both for a public good, public health, but there is also an opportunity to make Europe competitive globally. Well, those are our two objectives. That's really why we are funded. So I'm happy. I can meet the expectations that are put to me essentially by the European taxpayers. Why would companies engage? Well, this is obviously an important market. There is a lot of sick people, and there are a number of pharmaceutical medical device companies that have diabetes as their core business. Why would they then go into a collaboration? Well, that is probably to get access to the skills, to the experience, and to a scale that they can't do by just going out to individual academic groups and start collaborations, because that's always the opportunity for a company. If you come to a professor and say, can I pay a postdoc? Very few professors say no. And so that's always the alternative for the company. So here, the ability to set up, and I'll come to that, a European-sized clinical trial network for type 1 diabetes. Well, that's something you can't do as a single company. You need a partnership to set that up. So why would a philanthropic organization come in here? Well, of course, they have the engagement of the families, the parents, the donors to long-term change the landscape. Now, they are a relatively small player, and so by working with large players like IMI and with industry, they can come in and be part of and actually influence the ecosystem in a way that they couldn't do by themselves, because they don't have the muscle, they don't have the size. Why do we want to work with the small funders? I mean, we have quite a lot of money, as Michelle said, we have 2 billion. So why would we want to work with a small charitable funder? Well, what they have, and we don't have, they have those long-term links and partnerships with the domain. They really understand the landscape around T1D. And so here we have something then. We have a win-win-win. We get something. We get to work with partners that really know how to make a difference in the field. And we want to make a difference. And we do that in a field which is important for European competitiveness. And so, yeah, it's a win for IHI. It's a win for Breakthrough T1D. It's actually a consortium of European foundations. They have come together across countries. But they get to work with the large European funders, so they can have a scale that they could not do alone. Oh, that's very interesting. And for industry, well, they can work with this whole community to set up pan-European capabilities, something they could not do without partnering with the public sector. And so, win-win-win. This is a good topic. And we know it's a good topic because we've run 5 or 6 projects in this field over 10 years now. And so I'll take you through them. So we've had Inodia, as they were called. They were setting up this trial network. That was the first project. The second one was called Inodia Harvest, because you want to do something interesting with the clinical trial network. And so it ran a whole series of clinical trials. And if we look at that, it was one of the first that set up the patient advisory committee. It created this clinical trial network. And so it really put Europe on the map for type 1 diabetes research. And one of the effects is that actually Europe is starting to be a go-to destination for the emerging cell and gene therapies in type 1 diabetes. And then it created this association that can maintain the project's work. But I'll give you one example. I think this is really interesting, because one of the things that came out was a novel clinical trial methodology and a platform trial for a disease modifying treatment. And they could show that you could dramatically lower the dose for one of these compounds. But actually, if you look the effect, both on recruitment and the effect of the clinical trial result, they calculate they shaved about 6 years of the execution of that trial, because recruitment of patients was so much faster because you had access to all of these clinics around Europe. And with the new trial protocol, you could shorten the trial, which is, of course, really important if you work with children, because they are a complicated and vulnerable population. And so I think this is a really good example of the right topic. How do you think about win-win-win? How do you build collaboration? Well, you have to start with the right topic. We could do the same story in Alzheimer, but I'll move on. So right capabilities. So that's the other thing. So you've found the right topic. So you want to work together. Can you actually achieve something? And I think that's the other part where you think about public-private collaboration. So there needs to be an added benefit in terms of capabilities as well. So if we look at what is industry contributing. So in IMI, IMI2, and IHI, the unique thing is that the industry doesn't give money. In a way, cash is easy. Anyone can get money. It's hard to say, but actually cash is quite easy. What is much more difficult is to get access to the experts, the skills, the capabilities of industry. And I think that's what the unique insight with IMI, and we've continued in that tradition, is that industry doesn't come in and give money. Industry come in and work as an equal partner in the companies, in the projects. And so that means that you suddenly get access to things like regulatory expertise. The regulatory departments of large companies have experts in a way that very few academic centers have on regulatory science. You have engineering expertise. I'll give you an example. In medical technology, very few universities can build an MRI scanner or an interventional radiology robot in the basement with a postdoc. You need the engineering capabilities of the Siemens of this world. They have access to technology and capabilities in a way that very few academics have. Of course, product and drug development expertise. That's what they do, what companies do for a living. And so you get access to that expertise when you move through the pipeline. And of course, innovation management is another one. And I think a lot of our projects really benefit from that innovation management thinking. Where are we going? How can this have an impact long after the project finish? There are many individuals in industry who think about that and think about it every way. And so remember what I said about different perspectives when you do a collaboration. This is where actually it shifts perspective by bringing in industry experts. So one example I really like, this is a project called Maggio. They are doing something which is called radioembolization. Essentially, there are small, tiny, permeable beads that is filled with a radioisotope that you inject and direct to the size of the tumor in the body, and then you activate it so that the radioactivity is sort of set out, localized in the body. The idea of the project is to combine a lot of different instruments so that you, instead of a multi-step procedure, you can do this in one treatment with an advanced piece of equipment. And so in this case, it's the public-private partnership is obvious, right? There are a number of oncology clinics where they are testing out the new procedure on the patients, and there are a number of companies that are connecting their different equipment in a new way to see if you can speed up and shorten the procedure and have essentially what becomes an outpatient procedure where the patient visits the hospital, gets the treatment under a few hours, and then goes back home instead of staying for a number of weeks to get the treatment. So that's this is an example. I mean, so this can't be done with money, right? This really needs the innovation capabilities of the different partners. It's about a meaningful collaboration at the technical level, and I think that's where you have to think: what are the right capabilities? Not only think about the topic, but also of the capabilities. Can you do something which is truly novel and new? So that's I think that's an important part of collaboration. Just one, and I think, Michelle, you will like this. So when IMI was set up, a lot of academics, you lived this, so maybe you want to tell the story, but a lot of academics, learned societies, there were editorials in Nature were saying European taxpayers' money is wasted. The industry will take the results. There is no opportunity for academia to do research and publish. This will be a killer for young scientists. If you go into these collaborations, you won't be able to publish good papers, and so your academic career is screwed. I mean, that was essentially the debate 10 years ago. And consistently over 10 years, Michelle had to do a lot of work to show that actually the projects were scientifically excellent. And I think it started a tradition of scientifically excellent projects. And we we looked, you can do bibliometrics in a million ways. We picked the top 10% most cited papers simply because that's in the Draghi report. It's one of the metrics that Mario Draghi used in European competitiveness. But and it's a very good metric. I would argue it's the best metric because IMI comes out at the top. But if you do another metric, the order of the four first ones is a little bit jumbled. But I think what it shows is that if you do collaborations and you think about the right topic and the right capabilities, then there is real opportunities to do world-class and world-leading research. And I think that message has been reinforced over a long time. And so I put in the slide. I thought you would enjoy seeing that because there was a real battle around this 10 years ago. Yeah. So right topic, right capabilities, but still you don't have a project. Project is about doing work. It's not about having ideas. It's not only about having ideas and skills. You also need to put them to work. You need that framework. It's about the right implementation to drive the projects to completion. And so just a few thoughts to leave you there. So it's really is about that excellence, but it is about collaboration. How do you set up the projects? How do you monitor the projects? How do you fund the projects? How do you set up the right project structure? What are the work packages, meaning what people should be working together? How do you measure progress? How do you create indicators that shows the progress is being made? Project management is really important. Implementation is the difference between success and failure. Audis are fast because they have a very good engine. So never underestimate project management. It is a discipline in its own right. It's a very important discipline, and actually without good project management and most of these things will fail. And it's easy to be a little bit disparaging over some of the project management methodologies because they do look quite cumbersome, but they work. And implementation really matters. So that's about the framework of collaboration. So I thought I would end with just a few examples of where public-private really can make a difference. I think we talked about data. I think if we look at data in Europe, I think this is one of the big areas for public-private collaborations, including civil society actors. And maybe this is where Europe can find a sort of a middle ground. In US, a lot of medical data is essentially treated as a consumer product. You trade it freely. And it's the big insurance brokers. If you want to set up a study on healthcare data, it's not very difficult. You go to one of the big insurance brokers in the US and you can buy that data. It will be a very skewed demographic because a very large part of the population don't have access to healthcare. But you can buy data and you can get it essentially on the day. Other parts of the world, data is essentially treated as a commodity that you exchange in exchange for healthcare. And so if you have co-funded healthcare systems in many parts of the world, if you give your data away, you will get a lower cost of treatment. And so I think none of those models are acceptable in European societies. We have solidaric healthcare systems, and we expect that our data is treated essentially with the perspective of human rights, a basic fundamental sort of privacy perspective, rather than as a commodity that can be exchanged or a sort of consumer product owned by whoever sold you the goods, in this case, the healthcare. And so I think if we want to go make progress in Europe, we really have to think about this as a civil society, industry, public research collaboration. And this is where I think it's worth thinking about words like legitimacy, trust, and innovation together. And so legitimacy is really the legal part of that. Who has the right to look after the data. And what are the rights of recourse? And this is not easy. We have seen scandals in the Netherlands where the payment scandals for childcare, where an automatic system essentially said that a lot of people had got overpaid for healthcare and they wanted the money back. It turned out there was a bug in the computer system. In Sweden, there's been problems with school allocation. In the city where I live, in Gothenburg, they had an automatic algorithm for school allocation that forgot that there is a big river running through the city. And so what looked like 200 meters on the map was in reality about 25 kilometers commute for the children, because they can't swim to school, at least not in winter. And so so I think when we think about legitimacy of data and this algorithmic decision making that is coming with AI, there is a whole sort of body there where we need to think about what is the recourse, what is the rights, what is the individuals. That is quite different from trust, because you can be the legitimate user of the data and still don't have the trust from the people who are involved. And so I come back to my smart home with Alzheimer. You might have the legitimate use for that data from patient consent, but if the results that are coming out of your research isn't trusted by the community of people living with the disease, or the data isn't seen as representative for a large part of the population, whether it's socioeconomic, whether it's ethnic or disease, well, then you've eroded that trust. You're never going to be able to progress. Things will come to a halt. And so I think it's very useful to think about these two things in separate when you start your innovation program. And so I think this is an excellent area for public-private partnerships, because I don't think in Europe we will be able to make progress without this broad participation of public, of patients, and of society. So I'm going to round up here, and hopefully we have a little bit of time. I don't know what the time is, but I think we have time for a few questions. Yes, so all collaborations, transforming health, a few takeaways, cross-sector partnership, but we try to be a neutral space where a large number of stakeholders can agree. So we're coming back to that right topic. You have to agree. There has to be a win for everyone. And align healthcare innovation with society's need. Because we are spending public money, there needs to be a directionality. We're doing this for a public good. It's about capabilities to mobilize critical mass, but also resources and the skills to make things happen. And it is about execution. It's about connecting researchers, sectors, and patients and healthcare providers. And so the execution, the implementation really matters. So I think I'll leave you there. I've said this, and so the slides will come up. So thanks a lot. I hope we can have a little bit of a conversation and discussion. So thanks a lot, everyone.
Are there questions? Yeah,
This was really a great presentation. I'm really so happy to see the further development of IMI into IHI. I think that what you brought in is really remarkable. Now, you mentioned two challenges, and indeed, one of the challenges was to convince academic scientists that by working with industry, actually, they will increase their impact, and that in terms of publications, because that was always the question, it will be highly beneficial. Now, also related to this, there was the question of intellectual property. And intellectual property was really the subject of very hot debates when IMI was started. So I was wondering whether you could elaborate a bit on the issue of intellectual property in this public-private consortia, and to see whether you have the impression that this question is currently solved via some.
So I can start. So it's solved in the sense that just like under IMI, we still do projects. It's not solved in the sense that it's not easy. And so that comes back to the right topic. So maybe, I mean, it's a great question, and so maybe for everyone's benefit. So intellectual property patents. So when you make an invention, someone owns that invention. And what a patent does essentially is that you publish your invention and give it away to the public. And because it's registered in the patent database with all necessary information to reproduce that invention. And you do that in exchange for 20 or 25 years of market exclusivity. So you tell the public about your invention, and then in exchange, the public gives you the right to commercialize that for a very long time. So that's always been the deal on patents. And so, of course, when you do innovation together, this is really hotly debated. This is very difficult, and it's still difficult. I think it will always be difficult. We have changed the rules a little bit from IMI, and there is still debate on the rules, and I think they will change in the future, because the ownership of the invention is really complicated. And if I'm telling you how to breathe, then stop me. But when you start one of these projects, the first thing that everyone thinks about is what is called background. So Michelle and I work together. We have very different experiences. We have different knowledges. We have an amazing collection of scientific knowledge from your whole career. I worked in the data field, so I know how to make databases. And so when we work together, of course, we bring that knowledge into the project where we collaborate. Now, I still own, of course, all of the inventions I've done in the past, just like Michel owns all the inventions and insights that he's done in the past. But to work together, I need to get access to some of his work, and he needs to get access to some of my work. And so that's the first challenge, is how do you give people access to the work that you've done? And so if you come back to the image I showed on the interventional oncology, in that case, I think if it's Siemens or Philips, but of course, there are 4 or 5 companies working together. They will need to understand something of each other's devices on a very deep technical level, because how else could they couple them together? Now, they need to be confident that they're not giving away the crown jewels. So that's the first challenge. How do you regulate that background? And how do you give other people access to your background? Then they do something together. And so who's going to own that invention? So what is the piece that Philips owns? What is the piece that Siemens owns? What is the piece that AstraZeneca owns? That's a really good question. And that is indeed hotly debated. And then, of course, the academics are also contributing intellectually. They need a part of this as well. And so that's what's called the foreground. That's what you do together in the project. And you need to agree on how you're going to own that foreground. And then I think the third really complicated is because we work together on this project, but I learned a few things from Michel. And so I go and work with Hilde. And we had this great project together. And actually, that's really successful because some of the things I learned from Michel. So that's side ground. And so how do we deal with that? How would Michel get benefit from that? Or should we just screw him and share the spoils? That's a third really good question, isn't it? And so intellectual property was hard in 2010. It's hard in 2026. And I think it's going to be hard in 2040 when we look at the end of this. So the way we solve it, the rules are a little bit different. We have changed the rules, but it doesn't change the fundamental challenges that we talked about. And so essentially, we do the same thing as was done in IMI. We say, we don't start a project. We don't allow you to start. We don't give you any money until you have written a consortium agreement where you have agreed on these things. And I don't really care what's in that consortium agreement. The only thing I care about is that Michel and Hilde has written an agreement on how they're going to deal with intellectual property. And when both said, we have signed a legal agreement, I say, perfect, fine, here you get the money. So that those fundamentals have never changed, but they are equally challenging now, I think, as they were in 2010.
Thank you.
That was a very long detour, but
Are there questions from you?
of course, it's
Yes.
yes.
How does the Innovative Hub initiative is globally private? I was wondering how does it work to implement and collaborate with other realities, like in Africa? Do you have partners there, and like how does that how does that work?
Great question. Really, really good question. And it comes back to the last point on implementation, right? How do you make it work?
Yes, and also what type of partners do you have? And are you looking for partners? Kind of like what is the mindset like?
How do you think about it? Yeah, excellent question. In the Ebola program, so Michelle, you might want to add here because you have the mastermind in the room. They were actively looking to work with African partners. Actually, right now, we have changed that. And the reason we have changed that is because we have a sister initiative with a very similar initiative to IHI, which is called the European Clinical Development Partnership with Africa, EDCTP3. Doesn't roll off the tongue, but actually now it's very easy because I have an organization that is almost like mine, but with a specific objective of setting up trials and partnerships with Africa. In the days of the Ebola, I think this was very, very challenging because the infrastructure for implementation wasn't there, but you managed anyway. I don't know if you want to add anything, Michelle.
No, I think that EDCTP is a very important instrument to translate what's done in Europe in Africa. And I think that there are now, especially after the COVID pandemics, there are several initiatives to create, more capacities in Africa, including manufacturing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it used to be hard. It is actually much easier. And we have some really good examples in tuberculosis, actually, where projects that started in Europe, we handed over to EDCTP3 because you can only do clinical trials where you have the patients, and the patients are in Africa. And so they have run the phase 2 trials under EDCTP. We actually have a call open right now for a tuberculosis to be able to follow on some of the things that started in IMI. And so it's a great question, and I think it really points to this, the right implementation. You can have a good idea, but if you have no way of reducing that idea to practice, the idea doesn't matter. And getting the African partners on board with the Ebola, I think, was very difficult, very, very difficult. Now it is much easier because we have that. Yeah.
Ask a follow-up question. So, what is the win on the European scale to collaborate with? For example, Ebola is in Africa, so like, what is the win? Because it's supposed to be a win-win situation.
Yes. Well, so I think the win here, Europe tries to take responsibility for global health.
Okay.
And Europe and many European countries have large global health programs because there's one humanity after all. So I think there is solidarity is needed. So the global health programs, I think, they sit under that partnership and solidarity. Michelle, you want to?
Yeah, I think that it's even becoming more important with the current Trump policy, because I think that really to fight for global health and global approaches is really mainly the responsibility of Europe, because the US are really withdrawing from many organizations, including the World Health Organization. So it's really critical that this type of initiatives are really taken.
Plus it's an important partner. Many African countries are big, dynamic countries with lots of exchange. Something happens in Kigali, and 6 hours later it will be in Saventa, right? It's we are one world. But yeah, it's a good question. But win-win doesn't always need to be just, can I enrich myself?
Any other question? Thank you very much for interacting. Any other question? Then I'd like to end where I had to start, but forgot because I was busy with setting up slides and making sure that you started in time, that I didn't properly introduce you as in, and it goes back to the discussion we just had. We first met, and it was only afterwards that I realized we first met when I actually did my PhD on the question that you mentioned here. What about background IP, foreground IP, sideground IP? So at that point, I was intrigued by the setup of a public-private partnership and how it goes IP-wise. We met I audited a little 6 projects in IMI, which OpenFacts was one of, and you were the industry lead there. And indeed, I started 2010 with my PhD. That was the very start of IMI. There were huge tensions about what about IP. And I ended my PhD in 2015 feeling sorry that I didn't solve the question. But after 15 years, I hear that it's still not solved. And it will, as you will hear this afternoon, Daphne Derouan from UCB comes. She's leading there the IP department. And she will tell you that IP is something that creates friction, but it's really needed to stimulate innovation. So how to find that balance between the common good and what industry needs to make sure there is investment in innovation. But what I really enjoyed, and I think this is a huge takeaway, is that, and I ended my PhD saying, or my defense at least saying, that I couldn't solve the issue, but that trust is the main start. And without trust and a shared mission of different partners, and all partners have their own vision and mission. But for a public-private partnership to be a successful collaboration, you need to go in the right and in the same direction, regardless of what you do outside the consortium. In the consortium, you need to become one team and go straight forward. And this trust is crucial. Without trust, you don't come to this win-win where everybody wins. And indeed, I hope that this is too really a takeaway. A win-win doesn't always mean that people need to enrich themselves. Really, if Europe doesn't do it, we're in huge troubles because US won't do it. I hope we can restore, but there is a huge damage that is ongoing now, which we cannot restore. So this is really, really important that we take up, and also not only with respect to infectious diseases, think about climate change. It will hit us with migration, with climate change, with the temperatures rising. We also will be affected by tropical diseases at some time. So I think there's definitely a win for us in the long term, but indeed solidarity is what is the foundation of our European health system. And we should really defend this because it's the basis of why we are all in relatively good shape. Thank you so much for this wonderful message that you gave. We will quickly start again because I see we talked 5 minutes too much, but I'm very, very honored to have with us for the 10th time in a row, for being passionate about this program, really believing in what we do has added value for the next generation of healthcare professionals. Thank you for being here already for 10 years. Every year we get an update into the challenges and opportunities of innovation in healthcare. And Bruno is the best placed person to give it because he has an enormous track record of types of organizations. He has industry experience. He's a professor at the University of Namur, emeritus professor by now, I found. He has worked at EMA, the European Medicines Agency. So this organization approves new therapies. And you also worked as well for the Bayer So you have different perspectives, and I think you are the person to give this talk.
Thank you so much, Lida. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here for the 10th time, as you say, and celebrating the anniversary recently. So if you look at the presentation from 10 years ago until now, there are some changes effectively. And I think life in therapeutic innovation has changed actually dramatically during the last 10 years. I will try to illustrate this briefly. So I will focus on new medicines, not necessarily other types of therapeutic innovation, although there are the types of therapeutic innovation don't treat patients only with drugs or medicines. You also use devices, or nowadays more and more healthcare apps, maybe AI-supported apps. All of those are designed to provide better patient care, better clinical outcomes, and possibly better healthcare. Although for pharmaceutical industry, for instance, better healthcare is not maybe the major goal. Major goal is to improve the clinical outcomes. But this is therapeutic innovation. Now, an important aspect of therapeutic innovation is that there are regulatory constraints in innovation and how innovation is going to get to the patient. You just learned that innovation is just not the idea, it's the fact that it gets to the patient. And there you have to go through a lot of regulatory constraints. This is not unusual, I would say. If you think about the role of regulation in innovation, it's much broader than simply pharmaceutical industry. This is a quote I found some years ago about regulation of digital, aspects, digital innovations. The purpose is to enhance prosperity, sustainability, well-being, but you need to be careful about the risks. And the risk for privacy on one hand, and the risk for health on the other hand, because you could have a health adverse event in this way. Every innovation that can impact or affect individuals has to be regulated for this particular reason. And everyone agrees about this. And trans-regulatory regulation is even better than just local or national. However, they're not regulated in the same way, these different types of innovations. So if you look at them separately, for instance, if you put device, diagnostics, and technology together, you can think of some companies developing this approach. It takes them 2 to 7 years usually to put something new on the market. Will cost a number of millions, maybe 50 to 500 millions. And there is a particular pathway to control this, which are called notified bodies in Europe, which is also the FDA in the US, so it's different. And they put some restraints, especially in terms of high-risk device, for instance. If you put something in the body, you will have some restrictions, but not as much as for medicine, for historical reasons. If you look at the new apps, the healthcare apps, they're all over the place. Usually attached to some kind of wearables that can be developed in a few months and doesn't cost a lot to develop compared to the rest. And the only thing you have to be careful about is the global regulation in Europe about data protection. They have a similar system in the US, which is a bit less restrictive. Now, when we turn to medicines today, new medicines, from the time it is discovered until the time it gets approved, takes about 10 to 15 years. This is still the case today. Everyone hopes it's going to be faster, but we are saying this for the last, been saying this for the last 20 years, and it's still about the same, 10 to 15 years. The cost has increased tremendously. I will show you in a graph a bit later. Today, we are above 2 billion for one drug, for just one drug that gets to the patients. How is it possible? Because this cost actually incorporates all the other molecules that failed at the same time. They didn't make it to the patient, all right? And this cost of development, which failed in the middle, has to be recouped on the new drug. This is why the cost is so high. And the control is like EMA or FDA. I think you know these two agencies very well because there are many others in the world for all regions. These are the best known. This is quite different. The organization of these agencies is quite different because in the US, FDA, which has been there for more than a century, incorporates about 19,000 employees, although, as you've heard probably, the size is now decreasing. The expectation for next year is about 15,000. And I've noticed, I mean, everyone has noticed that 90% of the senior leaders of last year have disappeared. Some of them I knew very well, but just left the FDA. Some of them were fired, but most of them left on their own decision, and you know why. So there is a question mark now going on that side of the ocean. In Europe, we have a similar system of regulation, but the European Medicine Agency is a network, actually. It's not a big campus, because you only have about 800 people working in Amsterdam, where the headquarters are, but the rest is a network of all the European countries, and they work together to do exactly the same job, and eventually to approve drugs based on quality, efficacy, and safety. Okay? Now, I'd like you to consider this pathway, this journey to drug development in the terms of regulation, just to highlight that this control on what you are doing to develop a new product starts early on. Because as soon as you, as soon as you've discovered the drug, let's say this drug discovery takes about 5 to 6 years, depending. I mean, this is currently the mean. And then you have a product. And once you have a product, you will get a patent. You will try to protect this product as soon as possible, maybe not immediately, but as soon as public information goes out, you need to have a patent, otherwise people will copy it. So you get to this patent. And then you start the development, the preclinical, the clinical development, together with the manufacturing processes, depending on the delivery system. Already there is a control, okay, which is the good practice, what is called good practice. So good laboratory practice, manufacturing practice, or clinical practice. And this is controlled by international organizations, most of them regional, one for Europe, we have a different one in the US, WHO also plays a role. But that means that what you do at this stage in the process of developing a new drug is already different from what you do in your university labs, because you don't have GLP, I guess. This would be too complicated. The requirements are really high, and the monitoring, the controls are really high, just much too costly for universities to do all this stuff. That means that everything that's produced in a different way will not necessarily, maybe some part of it will be acceptable, but most of it may not be acceptable to get to this final stage. The agencies are already involved in the drug development. They talk to the company, to the industry, and they try to orient them in the best way. But finally, they will decide when they see all the results of the clinical and preclinical trials. They will decide if marketing authorization can be granted. And this will take about 10 to 15 years. Afterwards, and you've heard this already, but you will hear during your courses, the patients, especially in Europe, when you get the marketing authorization, doesn't mean you can get to the patients, because the national authorities, each country, have different steps, additional steps to control, I mean, the price, the reimbursement system, and actually who gets the drug in their own country, which differs across Europe. So that's additional stages. In the US, it's much faster. So there is also a role of the agencies in granting, if you want, this protection, which is in addition to the patent, you have data protection. That means that whatever you have discovered through your clinical development, your drug development, can also protect the drug from being copied for a while, between, let's say, something between 5 to 12 years. You can be protected as that a generic, for instance, cannot come on the market during that period. And this is also something that is granted at the time of marketing authorization. It's also a kind of regulation that actually helps the whole development in the end. Okay? So the challenge number one is regulation, but everyone knows about it. The question is this regulation going to keep up with the changes in science, with the huge changes in therapeutic innovation that we are seeing today? And I will illustrate them in a minute. I think yes, so far, because the agencies, the EMA, FDA, are constantly adapting. They know therapeutic innovation is there. There is even something that is called regulatory science, where people try to think of the best way, the most flexible way to still regulate, but be flexible. Now there are some challenges. For instance, the goal to try to get more personalized medicine, so not one fits all, I would say drug fits all, but drugs that are specialized for very specific type of patients. This will, of course, be a strain to the regulatory authorities. Animal testing, this will progressively disappear because the new technologies will not make it possible probably to test in animals in this regard. And now there is AI support, AI-generated insights that we get a lot in this regard. And there is still some uncertainty about exactly how they're going to be used. But okay, the agencies are ready. They've already published some information about this. Now, the recent uncertainties about the FDA, I mentioned, this is something that just been added last year, and it's not looking good. So I have an anecdote. I would like to tell you an anecdote about this regulation and to see that you can maybe bypass the regulatory oversight, especially in the US, because as you know, there is someone now in the US who's just against all forms of regulation and would really be happy to get rid of the FDA, right? So let's see if this can happen. I have the anecdote for you. Maybe you heard about it in the news. So the anecdote starts, before the anecdote, I would like to show you, to remind you about this new product or new products based on GLP-1, which are being, some people call them the most important therapeutic innovation for the last 30 years. And you know what I'm talking about because these drugs, in the way they have been developed, are now able to decrease weight in everyone by kilograms, by sometimes tens of kilograms. So the discovery of this peptide, which is just a 30 amino acid part of the protein, this peptide dates from 1982. And then, of course, it was quickly discovered that the main activity of the peptide, which is produced in the gut, is to increase the secretion of insulin. So this is why it was called insulinotropic or incretin. Okay? This is the activity. And of course, people, as soon as they discovered this, the industry was really interested, especially this industry, Novo Nordisk, to develop a product that would treat diabetes in this way. It seems to be a nice way to add to what we already had in terms of treatment of diabetes. Unfortunately, the peptide, if you try to inject it in the body, lasts only a few minutes, so it doesn't help. So they had to find a way to extend the half-life or the activity, the biological activity. And this was found very easily, actually, by changing one amino acid and by adding a small lipid anchor. And it works for about 24 hours. It still had to be injected, but worked for 24 hours. So once a day, that's very good. So they developed a product, Victoza, that was called for the treatment of diabetes and had some success. But in the meantime, this person in Novo Nordisk, who was in the industry, was still given a kind of, I would say, a blank check to continue working in an academic way. And she found, by herself, that if you inject large amounts of this product in the brain, it will have a very strange effect that no one expected. It will prevent the animals from eating or from overeating and also a little bit from eating. So it has a strong effect on the appetite in the brain, and it can induce rapid weight loss. So that was immediately thought of another option to develop the product in a different way. But they had to reach higher levels, which was not possible with this liraglutide, or barely possible. So they developed a new formulation, longer half-life, once a week, with much higher exposure in the brain, and that worked. And this came to be developed as Ozempic, first for diabetes, because it was immediately available. It was easier to develop it for diabetes first, and then for weight loss, a few years later, they changed the name, the meantime, but it's still the same compound. And it's been approved for obesity, not only obesity nowadays, but we have realized that this drug also protects the people with overweight against all kinds of cardiovascular disease or kidney disease, whatever. So it's really amazing. And the company that followed this path, Novo Nordisk, has become so successful that, just to give you a number, the market capitalization of Novo Nordisk at the end of 2024 was 60 billion dollars or euros implemented. This is more than the Danish, because this is a Danish company. This is more than the Danish gross domestic product. It's a bit less than Belgium, but still close to Belgium. Now it's getting lower. Okay, so the anecdote. No, before the anecdote, just to highlight again that this product have found a place now as #1 in the, I would say, sales success of therapeutic innovation. If you look at the single drugs actually that have been the most successful in terms of sales, return revenue. The first one was a statin. You all know this type of product, Lipitor. For many years was the #1 in the world. Then it was replaced by a monoclonal antibody, the Mira, against some autoimmune diseases, okay, for a while. And then more recently by also an antibody that creates cancer immunotherapy. You've heard that a lot of cancers today can be treated not by chemotherapy, but by immunotherapy. This is Keytruda. And now they will all reach something like 300 to 400 billion over time. But these drugs for obesity, not only Wegovy, but not only semaglutide, but also other drugs, will probably reach what is expected to be 1 trillion. It means it becomes really difficult to picture what 1 trillion is. Okay, so this is the setting. Now the anecdote starts last week with a company called Hims and Hers. It's a telehealth company, so developing apps for people, selling apps for people. And they decided to sell the compounded semaglutide. So what does that mean, compounded semaglutide? It means the company, another company, is able to produce the same molecule. It's very, very easy to imitate, of course, this molecule, same molecule, and sell it in the same way if, in the US, if the FDA has put the product on a shortage list. And Wegovy was put on a shortage list because so many people wanted it that the company didn't produce enough. So another company was able to sell the same, or apparently the same product for a while without any control from the FDA. Zero control from the FDA. This is illegal. Okay? So they did it for a few months, and then the FDA decided, no, the shortage list is finished now. Now you have to stop. They didn't really stop. They found some ways to continue a little bit. Anyway, in December last year, I mean, 1 month or 2 months ago, Novo Nordisk got the approval in the US to sell Wegovy in forms of a pill. This is a really therapeutic innovation because if you remember, semaglutide is a peptide. And if you take a peptide in your gut, through your stomach or your intestine, it will be destroyed immediately, like you digest all proteins. So they find a way to protect it and to have it absorbed in the body. It's a proprietary formulation that Novo Nordisk found. Now they're going to sell this pill. I mean, a lot of people prefer to take a pill every day than to have an injection once every week. Okay, so they are ready to sell it. But last week, this Hims and Hers company decided to launch what they call a holistic weight loss program, including a semaglutide pill. So they claim that they have done the same, prepared the peptide in what they call a liposomal technology formulation to be able to absorb it in the body, in the gut, without having it destroyed. Okay, and they will sell it to people at a lower cost, of course, than semaglutide, than Wegovy, and they have a lot of advertisement about the fact that they are not a pharmaceutical company. They are helping the people in the state and things like that. But they were ready to do so because they thought that the FDA would not react, with what's going on today. But they were surprised. I mean, a lot of people were surprised by the reaction of the FDA, which actually announced that they would they would sue the company for illegal use, yes, for violation of federal law governing the sales of medication, which is, of course, true, absolutely true. So the company Hims removed their compound, and now we are back to square one. So the attempt to avoid the regulation in the US in this case failed. I don't know if the next one will succeed or not, but certainly in the meantime, the stocks, the market stocks for both hims and hers and novo have crashed somehow because some people realize that the system is weak and maybe it will be overturned. So this is an anecdote to tell you how regulation is completely involved, I would say, in the use of this therapeutic innovation, especially in the US. Okay, now to illustrate some of the therapeutic innovation, you know probably a lot of this, but this is amazing. If you just look at this graph, for instance, the graph is designed to show you the breadth of the novel drug modalities. So this is across age. So if you look at the therapies we had before 1980, we had small chemicals, we had plasma-derived products, and some vaccines, inactivated or live attenuated virus. Okay, and that was good for a lot of diseases. And then in the 1980s until probably 2010, the recombinant molecules came in, recombinant proteins to replace something that is missing in the body, or congenital diseases, for instance, and monoclonal antibodies that were used for a lot of different diseases because they target, they have a much better targeting system than just chemicals. And the vaccines also improved by using subunit recombinant polysaccharide conjugate vaccine. So that was really a step forward. But the new step forward since 2010, probably even since 2015, is a breadth of new drug modalities that we never used before. All these products have different chemical approaches, but they are still drugs, they are still medicine. For instance, we now use oligonucleotides in the form, for instance, of small interference RNA. Some of you who are biologists know this very well. They are already used for some diseases. The antibodies are not only monoclonal, they have become multi-specific. Antibody drug conjugates for cancer, bringing the chemotherapy just on the cancer cells, radiopharmaceuticals, all this is starting to be used. The mRNA vaccine, I don't have to repeat the story of COVID-19, but this vaccine by itself saved the life of estimated probably 2 to 3 million people in the world. Could not have happened otherwise because all the vaccine would have taken much longer to be developed. So this was a breakthrough. Now, unfortunately, you may have heard another anecdote if you want. 2 days ago, the FDA refused to examine the mRNA vaccine for flu that Moderna has produced. They have produced a new flu vaccine based on mRNA technique, which may be better. We don't know yet, but may be better. So they've submitted this application all over the world, also in Europe. But in the US, for the first time ever, the FDA has refused to review it. Although the file is perfectly fine, they had been to the FDA before, they had agreement to come up, and now they have refused. Just a political decision, but no mRNA vaccines will ever be approved in the US under the same type of administration, and probably not any other vaccines either. That's a big issue. Really, coming back on your comments or comments about what Europe should do. Anyway, viral vector vaccine, DNA vaccines are coming up. And then this whole group of advanced therapy medicine product, this was the term used in the EU. The term was created before 2010, but now we see these drugs coming up. For instance, gene therapy, really modifying the genes of a patient, especially patients with a congenital disease, replacing the gene or putting a new gene instead by CRISPR. The CRISPR-Cas9 therapy that some of you may be using in the labs is now used in patients, only a couple of examples so far. The CAR T cells, extracting your T lymphocytes, re-engineering them ex vivo, and then re-injecting them with a chimeric receptor, for instance. Very effective in some cancer, now starting to be used in autoimmune disease. Probably in 5 years from now, the treatment of autoimmune disease will be completely changed by the arrival of these CAR T cells. This is a huge innovation that was totally unexpected. NK cells or immunotherapies, and the stem cells a little bit less. So when you see this, this is really, really striking. A particular impact was on people with congenital disease, rare congenital diseases, because they can be treated now with recombinant proteins or gene therapies, which was impossible some years ago, and their life can be totally changed because of this. So this is the breadth of the innovation. I'll just give you one example. I like this one. It's not recent. It's 2017, approved in 2017. It's called emicizumab. It's a bispecific monoclonal antibody. The cartoon here is to tell you that you think of monoclonal antibody as blocking something usually. Huh? Because it's a target, you block the target and you improve some disease. No, you can also create something. This bispecific antibody will bind to factor 9. Will bind to factor 9 and factor 10, 9 activated and 10, bring them together and continue the coagulation cascade. It actually replaces factor 8 activated here that is missing in hemophilia A. And so far the treatment was to replace factor 8. Now we can replace factor 8 with a monoclonal antibody, bispecific antibody that does the same as the natural molecule. Actually, it even does better than the natural molecule. So you can invent, thanks to these monoclonal antibodies, products that are better than your natural protein in the body. This is an option. Okay. Impact of therapeutic innovation on selected disease. I will not go into the details. Maybe if you have the slides, you can have a look yourself. All patients with this kind of diseases, especially, for instance, those with cystic fibrosis, those who are chronically infected with hepatitis C, they can now, at least chronic hepatitis C can now be cured. Most of the people will lose their eyes. And so on. Age-related macular degeneration, a very common disease in the eye. You heard that it's improving now with treatment. Okay, so this is changing really, really rapidly. And one particular group of patients already mentioned who are benefiting from these changes are people with rare diseases, not only congenital, but rare diseases in general. Why? Because already some time ago, a legislation was created, first in the US and then in Europe, to try to push companies to develop products for rare diseases, especially for areas where the return on investment would be negative if there were no incentives. So the idea was to create incentives for companies to develop. And this became extremely successful because if you look on what's happening now, so these rare diseases, they have slightly different definitions across the world. It's now available across the world. In Europe, for instance, it's a medical condition affecting less than 5 to 10,000 persons. That means about 250,000 across Europe. Should be life-threatening or chronically debilitating. There are now more than 700 different diseases considered as rare. Actually, if you add up all these rare diseases, 5% of the world, maybe 5%, maybe not in this room because we are selected, but 5% of the world population have a rare disease. So the incentive was a market exclusivity, meaning that no other drug with the same mechanism of action, even if it's slightly different, would be allowed on the market. So it's more than the data protection that I mentioned or the patent. It's more than this. It's market exclusivity, and it's fee reduction for assistant and submission of the dossier. If you submit the dossier to the FDA for marketing approval, the cost is more than 2 million. 2 million just to submit the dossier. So this is all free here for this orphan drugs. Today, if you look at the drugs that are approved by FDA, about 50% of them are for rare diseases. You may say this is a bit lopsided. Should we necessarily target people with rare disease compared to very common diseases where we don't do maybe as much as we could? That's a debate, of course. There's a huge impact on this rare disease population, but still insufficient. And half of these orphan drugs today are for rare cancers, not congenital disease, rare cancers, because among all the types of cancers we have, some are rare. Actually, a lot of them are rare. So that's also helping those patients. But the biggest problem today is patient accessibility and equity because of the cost, because of the price that these products, which have been shown to be effective in these populations, have when they come on the market. They usually have a high price. So governments, insurance companies have to decide whether to reimburse or not. And of course, you can imagine that going into a middle income or low-income countries in the world, doesn't happen so. So there is a need, in particular for the rare disease, for patient-centric collaborative care models, and this is also what we discussed previously. Now, to just take one step back and look at the global therapeutic innovation market, is it still continuing compared to what I've shown in previous slides? Yes, but there are some signs that it's fragile in a way. If you look at biopharma funding levels, this is just the amount of money in billions that is invested every year by all pharmaceutical companies, everything that is disclosed. And you can see that, yeah, there was a boost, of course, during the COVID-19, for sure. A lot of companies decided to try to develop drugs for this particular pandemic. Then it came down a little bit. It's now going up somehow, but fluctuating. The data for 2025 are not yet totally available, but you can see also on this slide that 25% of the investment in this therapeutic innovation comes from public. So from academia or from government organization to different ways to support the companies in their funding. So about 25%. It's still about the same. It's still maybe growing a little bit with this collaboration. Okay, but if you look at some other aspects of funding, for instance, what is called the venture capital funding, which is now a major form of funding for small companies, for instance. It's almost impossible to develop a small company if you don't get this venture capital. The venture capital is just the money that is floating in the world, and then people don't know what to do with it, and they don't want to leave it in the bank, so they try to find areas where to invest it. The biggest investment today, if I showed you the same graph for AI, you can imagine what this graph would do to that. It would be completely exponential. But for biopharmaceutical ventures, it's not so exponential. It's still a little bit, I would say, staying at the same level, as you can see, for the last probably 5 years. Even a bit more. Okay, so there are some signs that it's not completely exploding. On the other hand, when you see the therapeutic innovation in terms of drugs modalities, you could expect there would be much more investment. So there isn't. Why? Because the return on investment is not so sure. Because again, the drugs have to get to the patients and they have a price. Yeah? Now, one example that the innovation is really changing the way treatment are developed is to look, for instance, at the drugs that have been approved over the last 30 years, which are considered first in class. First in class means a new mechanism of action. Okay? And you can see that this was relatively rare until 2010, approximately. Well, only 1/3 of the drugs were first in class. The 2/3 were just copies, or me too, as we call them, of existing products. But now the first in class get to about 50%. And the trend seems to be continuing. So half of the new drugs will be totally, completely new mechanism of action, which is also a good. And you can see that all these new modalities I described previously are expected to become successful, I would say. Like, for instance, maybe 15% of new drugs will be totally innovative in terms of the modalities by 2030. So the field is going well, let's say, this regard. Now, AI. The question on AI has been here for every year. So until now, we said, okay, maybe it's going to help. Not today, we can say, yes, it is helping. It is already changing therapeutic innovation in medicines tremendously. Okay? If you can see, one way to look at it is to look at the deals that big pharma companies make with AI companies to help them develop new drugs. And these deals are in billions. For instance, like Roche is 1 billion, and for drug discovery here we have also huge deal. Last year was a recent one was with Novartis and Nvidia. Yes, you know Nvidia for the chips. So these deals are to develop new drugs. They are focused on drug discovery or drug design. So discovery based on a new target, sometimes also discovering new targets, and on drug designs. Now, they are not yet at the stage of helping clinical trials, but they are coming. Okay? So the big focus is here, and everyone knows that the efficiency of drug discovery, drug design will improve, will improve in the coming years. This is one example from beginning of 2025 of the drugs that are currently developing, phase 1 and phase 2 mostly, drugs that have been totally developed by AI, totally or principally. One of them has, this is always the example that is given, this new drug here, now it's called venetoclax, is a drug that has been discovered purely by computers, no human intervention. Okay? So AI was able to identify a protein in this disease, which is idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, a rare disease, but severe disease, to identify a protein that no one had thought would be of any help or of any use. The researchers in the academic labs have already looked at many, many different proteins in this disease, didn't find anything really effective. Now, AI discovered this protein and said, okay, I even helped to design the drug that would, offset this protein. And now they are in phase 2. They have some interesting results that will go into phase 2. So maybe this will be the first drug that has been completely invented, not by humans, but by computers. Okay. So what are the other challenges besides the regulatory challenges I mentioned? The biggest challenges is still what is called the productivity gap. So the cost efficiency, which is not good. And one way to look at this are the data from 1991 to 2023, so until 2 years ago, but still relatively recent. You look at the products that are approved by FDA or EMA, would be the same. Huh? So the number simply of these new drugs, totally new drugs, and the cost that was expended to develop them. And you see that the research and development expenses are just going up, not exponentially, linearly, but they are going up, while the number of new drugs is not going up. So a lot more expenses are put into drug development for the kind of similar output. And this is, of course, really disappointing. If you look at the other way around, I mentioned the cost of developing one drug. So if you look, for instance, in 1998, the cost of developing one drug was 1 billion. Now for 1 billion, you can only develop 0.3 or 0.2 drugs. So that means that the cost of individual drug is about 2.5 billion. But that's all over. That's really calculated very precisely. There have been many studies like this, but this one is very precise. We took the 200 top pharmaceutical companies and look at all their expenses, and all the drugs that they produce. So there is, of course, a delay, but even with the delay, the productivity is still low. And the major reason for this is the unsuccessful, I would say, low success of clinical trials. Clinical trials are extremely complex and cost a lot. I'll give you one example here, because I know this very well, because this is what we do, what I do day by day, take care of clinical trials with the teams. And the cost for a patient is between 50,000 and 100,000 euros today to have one patient in a trial. So if you think of a trial with 1,000 patients, okay, because this is the size of a big phase 3 trial, you multiply this by 1,000, you get 100 million. This is a typical study, just one study, 1 million. 100 million for one study. The cost is mostly for the monitoring and local measurements, because they have to be controlled, regulatory control, GCP or GLP for the lab tests. Investigators cost is about 1/4, central lab and biometry, stat, and so on. So this is what it costs today. We need to follow these GCP rules. We need to have a good manufacturing system attached to it. This is why companies are using contract organization to do this. And time is the main driver. Unfortunately, when you look at what happens with the current clinical trials, they are not recruiting faster than previously. Actually, they are recruiting slower. So it's more difficult to find patients and to find also the clinicians, the investigators that are, that agree to run this trial, because they know it's a lot of work for them. They are, of course, paid rather well, not in their own pockets, but for the hospital where they work, for instance. But nevertheless, I mean, it's extremely difficult to find. So there are recent efforts to try to decentralize the trials, to make them low, remote monitoring, and to use artificial intelligence. I'll give you an example, I think, later on. Okay, so this is what happens today. Again, a very nice, overview of these clinical trials during a recent period. You can see that the attrition means failure. So the failure rate in phase 1, the phase when you test the pharmacokinetics, safety, and these kind of things, is still 64%. Well, maybe it's a good thing because it stops drugs from being developed if they are unsafe, for instance, or if they don't expose, if they don't have a good exposure. So that's could be. Now, the recent, I told you, the recent studies based on AI show that we could reach about 80%. Success. It's the other way around. The phase 2 is also disappointing, and the phase 3 is still 40% failure, so 60% success. So the idea is that the AI will help in creating digital twins. I don't know if you heard about this. So that means that based on past experience, recent experience, the AI can create virtual patients that could be used as controls. So you don't need a placebo, you just create virtual controls, but very precise ones that resemble the patients in the trial very, very closely. And maybe you could save at least on the sample size a lot. So this is what's going on with the big companies. Something else that's going on in terms of clinical trials is that more and more smaller companies are trying to run these clinical trials because they want to develop their own product. And also the regions are changing. And the player that, of course, coming up to the top right now is China. In 5 years, it's very easy to see that China will be the top region in the world where clinical trials will occur. We're already number 2, I would say, but they are going up. And you can see with all kinds of treatments, especially the CAR T cells, for instance, there are a huge number of clinical trials in China and only a few in Europe and in the US. And you can see the proportion of clinical trials in Europe that it was still 44% in 29 is now down to 21% and going down. So actually, yes, the field is changing regionally. One big problem also, which is a big challenge, is about what comes up later when you are approved and you try to get to the patient, so accessibility to the patient. This is determined by price, by cost. And there is a big problem today, is that the majority of this cost is due to what happens in the US, where the price of drugs is much, much higher than in the rest of the world. For instance, if you compare the prices in US compared to in Europe, this is about 4 times higher. The same molecule, the same product costs 4 times larger price in US. That means that the companies, when they develop new drugs, they look at where the revenue will come from. And of course, this is written data of last year. 67% of the revenue comes from the US, 15% only from the top 5 European countries. If you put these top 5 countries together, we have the same population as the US, approximately. So that's a big difference. So that's still a problem today. And this is probably not sustainable. And we should find a way not to be driven in terms of cost only by the return of investment in the US. But how can we change it? Finally, I'd like to talk about the unmet needs, because this is, of course, any therapeutic innovation should be targeted to fill some unmet needs. But the unmet needs are not always easy to define. The companies, when they develop products, they think of filling an unmet need, but this is not the only reason. The other reason is they may have a technology, a proprietary technology, a platform, specific knowledge, which pushes them to develop one particular type of drug, not necessarily the one we need the most. and the opportunities offered by collaboration, for instance, can also orient them in some way. The regulatory agency, they try to orient the industry towards unmet needs. And how do they do so? Well, they give incentives, and they try to define unmet needs in a specific way. But in the end, of course, it's the pricing and reimbursement authorities, the healthcare system, the prescriber, the patients who will decide which drugs will be important for them or not. Right. So these are the incentives created by the agencies. I already mentioned the orphan designation. They have other incentives. For instance, they can promise to review faster, so priority review. They can designate some drugs as breakthrough therapies, so providing some advantage to the companies, especially coming on the market faster. They have accelerated approval, these kind of things. So this is trying to orient the development towards unmet needs, but the unmet needs themselves are difficult to define. Actually, you may have heard that in Europe, there is an initiative by the European Commission already that published in 2023 a proposal for a new directive for the pharmaceutical legislation, to changing the pharma legislation completely in Europe. Okay? This is called the new EU pharma package. They call it the pharma package. So they make a proposal, and now the Commission, this is the European Commission, sorry. Now the Council, the European Council and the Parliament have to look at this. They have looked at this during the last 2 years, and they have agreed. They have agreed in December to have a proposal. We don't know exactly the content of this proposal, but they have agreed. But one aspect, one important aspect is in this legislation is to link the incentives, like for instance, the market exclusivity or the data protection, to the fact that the drug is designed for an unmet need. So they need to define unmet needs, right? So now, we don't know the definition that was agreed, secret, but it's probably something like the treatment is inadequate in terms of efficacy, safety, or impact on disease progression, okay, in the whole population or in subpopulation, and the new treatment is clinically relevant. So that means it brings something which is probably close to what the patient expects. So maybe this is trying to bring the notion of unmet need a bit closer to what patients and insurance systems, social security systems expect. Okay, so we'll see. But there will be a lot of discussion this year when the document will be published. All right, so I hope I try to illustrate some aspect. It's just impossible to illustrate every aspect of therapeutic innovation. But from what you heard, I hope you realize that the breadth of novel drug modalities is just staggering, just amazing. Okay? And the medicines regulatory agencies are adapting to this. So in principle, there should be no impediment there. The rising complexity and costs of clinical trials, yes, this is a big concern, especially in view of the productivity gap that I showed you. So this should be improved. And AI is proposed in one way to do it. We don't know yet. We know that AI is transforming drug development at the early stages. Will it transform the clinical trials in a similar way or in an effective way? We don't know today. But there's a lot of hope, I would say. Biopharma funding remains stable, but somewhat, I would say, hesitant, can change from 1 year to another. And the small, if you work some of you work in biotech, they know this problem very well. Very difficult to find capital nowadays in this regard. Economic sustainability of innovation, I think, is jeopardized by US price dominance. Will that change or not? Possibly, but we do not know today. And finally, last two questions. It's a bit for you. I didn't develop them, but maybe trying to find some way to force the therapeutic innovation to target the most relevant unmet needs. Okay, so if you have some ideas, you can discuss with the policymakers. And public trust in innovation. I haven't developed this point, but you probably know there is a lot of mistrust today, public mistrust in drugs, in medicines, vaccines, for instance. So what about the trust in innovation? This was actually touched upon in Nicolas' presentation and something maybe you can think about in the rest of your courses. Okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Flamion. Are there questions? Yes.
In your presentation, I have a question about the personalized medicine aspect. So, I understand it's a challenge at the moment to actually implement the idea is good, but it's a challenge to implement the clinical research of personalized medicine and then the approval under which category they fall. Are there advancements in that?
There are advancements, but not, I would say, extremely fast. The question is being posed, of course, many years ago. And there are some drugs, today that are totally personalized. For instance, if you have a cancer, one idea would be to take this cancer, analyze the expression of some proteins, and then develop a drug for you, maybe antibodies targeting these particular proteins in your case, and then inject this drug. So this is possible. It will take a little while. It's a bit like the CAR T cell. But the CAR T cells can be generated in an industrial way. Right? But if you have a really, really personalized treatment, how will the regulatory agency approve it or not?
Exactly.
Today they have not solved this question. So they can approve the process, but not the product itself. That would be the trick. I think they are ready to do so, but it still takes a lot of examples, discussions. But this is coming. I'm sure this is coming. But in many diseases, you can see that the patients are not responding in the same way, and the reasons why some patients are responding and not the others, we can find them now sometimes, because it's a different gene, for instance. If you look at the autoimmune disease, for which I told you that the field is going to change completely, you can see in autoimmune disease if you have lupus, you don't have rheumatoid arthritis. Depending on the genes that you have, you react completely differently.
Do you see from the regulatory perspective, for example, it's not the same as for drugs, of course, but to have maybe like a specific category.
Personalized medicine.
To have incentive for
No, I think this is a good suggestion. I'm sure there are think tanks about this, and if you can try to get into them, it would be really good. Good question, good point.
Any other question? Well, many things of the topics you alluded to will come back throughout the different modules of the program. So it definitely will deeper in some of the incentives, for example, the regulatory pathways that are being set up, tested. So thank you very much, Professor Flamion, for your wonderful talk.